And let me introduce David first. He's he's George Valley Distinguished University Professor and also John and Ella G. Charlton Professor of Philosophy at Queen's University in Ontario. And he's also a key researcher at our research team in Kaliningrad. And David works especially on epistemology, metaphysics, Wittgenstein, and ethics, and the philosophy of education, and all the relations between these topics here. So David, your floor.
So notwithstanding my connection to the Academia Kantiana and its project, I am no kind of Kant scholar. So the paper I'm going to offer is, I guess, at best an entertainment rather than a work of scholarship. Anyway, Kant, as we all know, describes the injunction to think for oneself as the motto of the Enlightenment. And it's perhaps the only Enlightenment credo to seem immune to the skepticism of contemporary philosophers of education, for who would deny that we should encourage students to think for themselves? It's not easy, however, to give a compelling philosophical account of what it is to think for oneself, in part because of the temptation to take one of two mistaken approaches to the issue, the first of which makes the topic too easy, the second makes it too hard. So, what I have in mind is this. The first approach denies that when it comes to thinking for oneself, there's really anything much of philosophical substance to discuss. You can imagine a philosopher joking in the spirit of Gilbert Ryle or Austin that, of course, no one can literally think for anyone else. Insofar as we think, our thinking is our own. So all that can be meant, and all Kant surely did mean, is that people should not think and act uncritically. They should not simply believe what people such as teachers, religious authorities, or political leaders tell them, or unreflectingly conform to conventional ways of thinking and acting. Now that's true, but it's almost truistic. And while theorists of education might want to consider how best to encourage students to think for themselves in this sense, nothing here really needs philosophical attention. The second approach reacts to the first by claiming that there is a big philosophical question at stake, namely, what is it for someone to take responsibility for their beliefs and actions? In the theoretical domain, this raises issues of the cogency of epistemic individualism and the nature of epistemic dependency. And in the practical domain, the issues concern what it is to act in a morally responsible way. These are obviously deep philosophical questions. The problem, however, is that if one thinks like this, the issue tends to get turned over to and absorbed into epistemology and ethics. And we lose sight of a distinctive subject matter, what we might call the philosophical psychology of thinking for oneself, which we might hope to illuminate or complement ideas of education. So let me try to bring out the depth of the issue in another way. The first flippant approach trades, of course, on the fact that we all have a good intuitive grasp of what it is for someone to think for themselves. It includes the idea of someone who is not a slave to authority or convention, and the correlative idea of someone who is critical, who can give reasons which they have somehow made their own in defense of their words and deeds. This is the idea of someone who seeks to understand or comprehend phenomena for themselves and to understand the conditions of their own understanding. There is also the idea of someone who has their own voice, who shows originality and creativity, and who, if they are indebted to the views of others, adopts those views in a way that, again, makes them their own. These are qualities you're looking for right now in what I am saying and doing. You know what you're looking for, and you know whether you found it, even if it is hard to articulate exactly what it is. One difficulty is that there are ways of thinking for oneself that we want to exclude from the broadly Kantian picture. For example, an anti-vaxxer may urge others to think for themselves and reject the vaccine, and may urge this for reasons he's made his own and which he expresses in his own voice. And these reasons may show a certain originality and creativity. Yet this is not the kind of thinking for oneself we had in mind. What is critical is that those who think for themselves are guided by the right kinds of reasons adequate to the matter at hand, and that they have the right kind of active relation to them, that their thinking befits the autonomous self-determining activity of a rational agent. And that seems right, but the question now becomes, what kind of thinking is that? And once that question's open, it can't be entirely closed by Kant's idea that it's thinking from a universal standpoint. That is, thinking guided by reasons grounded in principles the thinker can give himself as binding all rational beings. So let's engage in a bit further in some discursive reflection on what it is to think for oneself. So in homage to the country where this conference would be taking place, were it being held in person, I want to give an example about some Russian philosophers of the Soviet era who had the courage to think for themselves. So on the 7th of December, 1967, Komsomolskaya Pravda, which was a newspaper, the newspaper of the Komsomol, which was the Union of Soviet Youth, Komsomolskaya Pravda published a report on a roundtable that the newspaper had organized on the nature and purpose of philosophy. The article, entitled "The Courage of Thought," or "The Courage of Thinking," was written by Alexander Tsipko and Igor Klyamkin. They were both students at Moscow University at the time, but they later became influential political thinkers under Glasnost and Perestroika, and in the both of them had fellowships at the Wilson Center in Washington. But way back then, they were students at MGU. So the article begins by quoting a letter from a schoolgirl to the editors. The letter says, "If all the laws of being are known, as the textbooks of Marxism and Leninism tell us, what use is philosophy?" That question is then debated by Evald Ilyenkov, who's a philosopher on whom I've written a good deal, Felix Mikhailov, who was my mentor and friend for a long time, and 6 other philosophers, Arseniev, Batishev, Bibla, Narsky, Samsonova, and Sokolov. The article interweaves quotation and commentary, touching on such questions as the nature and extent of young people's interest in philosophy, how philosophy is taught in the USSR, whether philosophy should be approached for its history, whether philosophical ideas should be popularized. The discussion's noteworthy for its lively and argumentative character. The participants voice disagreement, contradict one another. It might appear that no coherent position emerges from this diversity of opinion, but it's important that 5 of the participants form a cohort of like-minded thinkers. In the mid-1960s, Arseniev, Batishev, Bibla, and Mikhailov were all much influenced by Ilyenkov. It's therefore illuminating to read their respective remarks as contributions to a common cause. And if one does that, the following picture emerges. So collectively, they argue that the cultivation of philosophical consciousness is critical to the future of humanity. Soviet citizens, however, can be forgiven for doubting this because philosophy in the USSR is so badly taught. Marxist philosophy, indeed philosophy as such, is a unity, but the orthodoxy is to divide the discipline into dialectical and historical materialism. Students are thus offered 2 dismembered parts of a living whole. In the first, they get reality without humanity. In the second, humanity without reality. Moreover, philosophy is represented as merely generalizing the findings of other sciences. And so dialectical materialism is reduced to a set of abstract and ultimately vacuous laws that students are told to commit to memory. Thus, philosophy becomes ossified doctrine rather than spirited thinking, and students pass philosophy courses by cramming rather than exercising their powers of thought. But this is not real philosophy, for philosophy is method, not doctrine. Its history is a history of searchings. It makes progress not by deciding issues once and for all, but by raising its problems to a new level of understanding. And these problems reflect its distinctive subject matter. Philosophy is the science of thought, or the science of thinking. So philosophy doesn't just study thought sideways on, it cultivates critical thinking. As Bibla puts it, philosophy begins where stereotypical thinking stops, where critical self-consciousness starts, where the self-evident begins to call forth doubt. The proper study of philosophy exposes students, therefore, to a treasure trove of ideas in a way that encourages independent and autonomous thinking. In their commentary, Klimkin and Tsipko continue this line of argument, affirming that such thinking is essential to human flourishing and a necessary condition for instituting reform and realizing a socialist future. The unity of philosophy as a discipline, its interest in knowledge as such, is an antidote to a technocratic cult of narrow specialization. Philosophy reminds us that socialism concerns the all-round development of the individual. Its task is therefore to cultivate our humanity, to make human beings of us, so that we may become authors of our identity. And the article concludes, a person whose brain is loaded like never before with tons of complex, diverse, and contradictory information needs a profoundly moral, general humanitarian orientation, which Marxist philosophy is called upon to give. From it, we draw critical self-consciousness, the demand for truth, the courage of thought. So read this way, the article both argues for the cultivation of the power to think for oneself and exemplifies that power. At the dawn of 1968, Ilyenkov saw the end of Marxist philosophy and the communist project as such, as the flourishing not of class or party, but of real human individuals engaged together in autonomous critical activity. Socialism was to create conditions in which truly self-determining activity becomes possible and possible for all. And since such activity is the mark of our species being, socialism creates the conditions in which we can become human. Philosophy therefore has a vital educative and moral role in engendering critical self-consciousness and confronting the forms of alienation that stifle and distort it. Of course, this responsibility lies not just with philosophy. The entire education system must cultivate and sustain powers of critical thought central to the nature and possibility of human flourishing. That's a theme that figures in many of Ilyenkov's now much neglected writings that are devoted specifically to education. So the humanistic character of this position is it reflects the spirit of the times. The Prague Spring, with its advocacy of socialism with a human face, was in the making, and the concern about how to orientate oneself in thinking in a world where one is bombarded with information was typical of critical Marxist skepticism about the transformative potential of the scientific technological revolution that was at the time much trumpeted by the Soviet authorities, and not just the Soviet authorities. Harold Wilson in England gave a famous speech about the white heat of technology and so on. So did it take courage to think as Ilyenkov and his colleagues thought? Yes, you bet it did, and even more courage to express those thoughts in this roundtable. The roundtable's humanistic themes, together with the disputatious character of the discussion and the open criticism of the teaching of philosophy in the Soviet Union, provoked an angry response from the philosophical establishment, and many of the participants suffered. Mikhailov, for example, lost his job as head of the philosophy faculty at the Second Medical Institute. Ilyenkov himself emerged relatively unscathed, though the incident contributed to his persecution as a revisionist, and that intensified after the Soviet intervention in Prague in August the following year, and continued till his death by suicide in 1979. So the example of Ilyenkov and his colleagues vividly illustrates people thinking for themselves about what it is to think for oneself. And in the course of the discussion, various philosophical notions are invoked, some with a definite Kantian resonance: critical self-consciousness, education as becoming human, the courage of thought, and so on. So how can we use this example to deepen our philosophical understanding of what it is to think for oneself? So reflecting on the example helps us unpack some issues around epistemic individualism. It's sometimes felt that there is a tension between thinking for oneself and thinking with others, thinking collaboratively. But I think the example shows that the concern is illusory. And in this, I've learned a lot from discussions with Martin Sticker, with whom I'm editing the special issue on Kant on education and improvement that Thomas mentioned in the introduction. So collaborative thinking takes a variety of forms, two of which are illustrated by the roundtable, which is, of course, a forum designed to facilitate collaborative thinking. The first is that the participants reason together about a topic and engage with each other's views, rather in the way that we are doing here. The second is that some of the participants saw themselves as presenting aspects of what was essentially a collectively held position. So they were collaborating not just in debating an issue, but in advancing and refining a common vision. Now, Kant grants that collaborative reasoning is important. Defending freedom of speech, he writes, "Of course, it is said that the freedom to speak or to write could be taken from us by a superior power, but the freedom to think cannot be. Yet how much and how correctly would we think if we did not think as it were in community with others to whom we communicate our thoughts and who communicate theirs with us?" But Kant doesn't say all that much about why thinking in community is important. I'm sticking my neck out saying that. I'm sure Thomas will tell me I'm wrong. But anyway, so commentators tend to point to the fact that when we learn from others, our horizons are broadened by exposure to their views, which can test our beliefs, giving us reason critically to assess our own views. To this, I want to add a further dimension, rarely discussed, I think. Collaborative reasoning is not just a matter of the participants comparing and evaluating antecedently held beliefs. It also has a generative or creative role. That is, conversation and debate can be a source of new ideas that emerge out of the discussion, often in ways that make it difficult to attribute them to particular participants. That's why we come together in conferences like this and hold seminars and colloquia and so on, in the hope that new insights and ideas will come forth in this way. Such creativity is not easy to theorize. Ilyenkov thought we had an obligation to do so, and that was part of the mandate of philosophy as the science of thinking. And he turned to the idea of dialectic to do so, but let's not go there. It's enough to recognize that this is perhaps a more than merely contingent feature that makes collaborative reasoning significant. In any case, collaborative reasoning poses no threat to the idea of thinking for oneself, because it presupposes that the individual participants can do precisely that. You are of no use to me in intellectual collaboration unless you are independently minded. Of course, if we are to think together, we must have various intellectual virtues. We must listen, be open-minded, generous in interpretation, articulate in expression, willing to revise our views when that's warranted and in the interest of making progress on the matter under consideration. But we have to think for ourselves, both singularly and collectively. So someone might complain at this point that my invoking Ilyenkov is a poor choice to illustrate what it is to think for oneself. But wasn't Ilyenkov a Soviet Marxist who was deeply committed to Marxist doctrines and who wrote favorably about Lenin's excursions into philosophy? So there were aspects of Marxism that Ilyenkov was not prepared to question. And we can argue, of course, about the limits of Ilyenkov's independence of mind. Because while the power to think for oneself may be all or nothing, its exercise admits of degrees. Ilyenkov's originality was framed by certain unshakable commitments, the potency of which we may doubt in ways that he was not prepared or able to. But I want to suggest we're all, in a way, in a similar position. Our worldviews, our webs of belief, our conceptions of the world are structured by deeply entrenched convictions, akin to what Wittgenstein called famously hinge propositions, which can be subjected to critical scrutiny, but only at significant epistemic and arguably existential cost. It's very disruptive to challenge such deeply held beliefs. And arguably in Ilyenkov's case, the collapse of the Prague Sprint began a process in which he lost faith in some basic convictions. And the strident writings he produced on Lenin late in his career were a kind of desperate expression of faith rather than of conviction, a way of pretending to himself that he still believed. Well, his situation was very distinctive, but his predicament was one we all share to some degree. And so this brings us to issues of epistemic dependence. Discussion of this topic often takes the following form. Much of what we know, we do not discover ourselves. We learn it from books, newspapers, the internet, or from the words of others, family, friends, teachers, colleagues, and so on. So you learned today something about Ilyenkov from me, and the knowledge on which I base what I told you, I learned from texts and from personal conversations with Mikhailov, Bibler, Arseniev, among others. So if you now know what you learned from me, then you must be justified in believing it. You must be able to take epistemic responsibility for those beliefs. You've got to be active with respect to them. But what does that demand? Kant's maxims of common thought, articulated in the Critique of Judgment and the Anthropology, which are really an elaboration on the idea of thinking for oneself, require that one is the genuine author of one's judgments and that one is accountable to others. The difficulty for the epistemic individualist is to show that that's a responsibility we can bear as individuals. It's helpful to situate this issue, I think, in a broader perspective than is usually offered by analytic epistemology. Let us reflect on how the power to think for oneself comes to actuality in the human individual. For both Kant and Ilyenkov, this is not, or not just, a question of the maturation of an innate capacity. It requires a process of formation or Bildung, education in the broadest sense. What does that entail? The learning of one's native language and enculturation into the practices of one's community so that one can find one's way in the normative landscape of one's environment. The acquisition of knowledge, factual and practical, the gradual acquisition of styles of thinking and reasoning, and so on. In this way, we become human, as both Kant and Ilyenkov say. On such a view, each individual does not find the world anew for herself. Once the individual's power to think for herself is a going concern, that individual already has something akin to a worldview. To learn one's native language, for example, is not to learn a technical device for the communication of antecedently formed thoughts, as Hobbes and Locke imagined. In acquiring a language, the child acquires a whole range of beliefs. In a course of learning the word, say, cow, the child acquires beliefs about cows, that they're animals, they eat grass, they moo, they live on farms, and so forth. So in exercising the power of thought, we're always thinking from somewhere, and indeed from somewhere into which we have been thrown, to use a Heideggerian metaphor, or where we find ourselves. Moreover, our situation is profoundly Neurathian. To take responsibility for any particular belief, we can only subject it to criticism in light of other beliefs for which we take ourselves to have good, or at least better, grounds. In this, of course, we must be open to the counsel and criticism of others who may know better. And as long as we are active in relation to their guidance, we do not subdue our power to think for ourselves. So to take responsibility for one's beliefs must amount to being ever ready to reflect critically on one's grounds for belief when one has reason enough to do so. Moreover, as McDowell has emphasized, this requires willingness not just to revise particular beliefs, but to refashion concepts and conceptions, if that's what reflection recommends. So while it's rare that such reflection might lead to the upheaval of commitments fundamental to the structure of our worldview, it's not impossible, and that is the predicament in which Ilyenkov found himself. Perhaps there are ways in which a rational being must think, categories that necessarily structure its thought and experience, truths that must apply to the world as a rational being finds it. Kant thought so. McDowell, I guess, does not. But Ilyenkov's Marxist commitments, anyway, however fundamental they were to his view, weren't like that. So let's take stock. I began by contrasting two approaches philosophers might take to the idea of thinking for oneself. The first holds that the notion is perspicuous to common sense and that philosophical analysis isn't needed. The second sees philosophical depth in the notion, but outsources the issue to epistemology and ethics. I tried to do better, or at least to do it differently, by trying to capture and elucidate what we already know about the nature and value of thinking for oneself, in particular by reflecting on the example of Ilyenkov and his colleagues at the infamous Komsomol roundtable, and to do so in a way that would bring some genuine philosophical issues into view. I've sought to show that thinking for oneself is compatible with the idea, indeed with the necessity of collaborative reasoning, that beings can think for themselves even if they're profoundly epistemically dependent, both in the sense that vast amounts of what we know we learn from others, and in the sense that our very powers of active thinking are actualized in us only through a process of formation in which we are in myriad ways dependent on others, and which suggests that our epistemic situation is always Neurathian. As a result, while I endorse the view that a being that thinks for itself is responsible for its beliefs, all we can require is that we are prepared to scrutinize the grounds for our beliefs and to reflect on the cogency of our concepts when called upon to do so, and that we hold ourselves to epistemic standards that demand grounds for belief that are compelling and consistent. To this, we might add that the view I sketch represents the flourishing of the power to think for oneself as the achievement of a Bildungsprozess. So the picture embodies a view of the end of education as the power to determine for oneself what to think and do in light of what there is most reason to think and do. This is the ideal of a rational being, and insofar as our humanity and our rationality are a unity, then education makes us human, as Kant taught. So starting from a commonsensical view of thinking for oneself, we've arrived in short order at a position, certainly philosophical in character, about what a human being is and the role of education in the actualization of its essential powers. So let me conclude by climbing down from these philosophical heights and making a couple of observations, one about philosophy of education and one about the practice of education. So what does philosophy of education have to say about how we should educate people to think for themselves? The longest standing and most systematic treatment of this issue comes from the advocates of critical thinking, though in recent years, critical thinking approaches have been challenged by those who focus instead on the cultivation of intellectual virtues. So consider a recent paper on this controversy, jointly authored by Ben Kotze, Adam Carter, and Harvey Siegel. It's called Educating for Intellectual Virtue, a critique from action guidance. It appeared in Episteme in 2019. The discussion is cast in terms of the end of education. What's the primary end? To produce critical thinkers or intellectually virtuous thinkers? The article decides in favor of a critical thinking approach grounded in, I quote, the theory and principles of good reasons and reasoning, which teaches students what critical thinking is, why it is good, and why uncritical thinking is bad, and how to think critically. So critical thinking here is to be preferred because it's teachable. Its norms can be specified in procedures and principles and can therefore be taught as such. Hence, textbooks of critical thinking typically include logic, formal and informal, probability, scientific method, fallacies, and so on. In contrast, the intellectual virtues, such as curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual courage, and intellectual honesty, can be exemplified and emulated, but not taught and learnt as such. This is the argument in the paper. That's because it's really difficult to explain what it takes to be courageous, open-minded, or creative in a way that it isn't hard to explain what it is to be consistent. And the ability to discern what is, say, genuinely creative as opposed to showy or speculative is not codifiable. Moreover, it's not true that a less than fully intellectually virtuous person ought always to act as a virtuous person would. Not being as good a footballer as Harry Kane means that I shouldn't attempt to do what Harry Kane does, but I should set myself lower standards. And similarly, not being as brilliant a philosopher as Kant, I shouldn't have the kind of awe-inspiring intellectual ambitions that Kant had, but express my insights such as they are without such systematic and comprehensive aspirations. So learning to be virtuous is not a matter of imitating, it's a matter of emulating in the right way and the right respect. And that, so the authors contend, makes it impossible to articulate a coherent pedagogy for the teaching of intellectual virtue. Okay, so I have to say I'm kind of unpersuaded by this argument. First, for Wittgensteinian reasons, maybe Kantian reasons too, rules don't apply themselves. And so even if principles of critical thinking can be codified, students still have to get them. Further, there are many skills involved in thinking well, such as the evaluation of evidence, the weighing of reasons, the determination of epistemic relevance, that rest on sensibilities, the exercise of which is arguably non-codifiable. Moreover, we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the non-codifiable can be taught. vast amounts of what we learn, even in formal educational settings, we pick up by osmosis, imitation, emulation, habituation, internalization, and other such amorphous phenomena, and not by learning to follow rules. This is true, for example, of virtually everything I know about how to be a philosopher. In addition, the critical thinking literature has little to say about the generation of ideas, the cultivation of insights, the refinement of concepts, the articulation of novel views. And I stand with Ilyenkov in holding that if you have nothing to say about the creativity in thinking, you don't really have much to say about thinking at all. So finally, I'm not sure actually that there's any empirical evidence that people who have been taught critical thinking are in fact better thinkers than those who haven't. So although staging a turf war between critical thinking and virtue epistemology is good for business in the sense that it produces articles for refereed journals, I think the philosophical dispute is superficial. We should educate for critical thinking, for intellectual virtue, and for anything else that nurtures, sustains, and encourages the power of thought. The philosophy of education needs to rise to that challenge. And so finally, a thought about the practice of education. This is very brief. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter much what philosophers of education say, it matters what teachers do. And I think there are some unfortunate trends in education that are bad for independence of mind, and which actually have been exacerbated by the necessity to teach remotely under COVID. So here I'm speaking about trends in higher education in North America, possibly in high school settings too. And I guess it would be interesting to see how a very international audience like this, whether you see in what I'm about to say, something that resonates with you. So what I have in mind is the requirement that courses are designed with highly regimented syllabi that serve as a kind of contract between teacher and students. The tendency to package materials for students so they don't have to look for sources or even enter a library, to motivate them to study by regimes of constant assessment so that they read or study only that for which they will be given a grade, to specify in detail how an essay is to be composed, and to articulate a rubric detailing criteria by which the essay will be assessed, and so on. I think all of these practices, which are ubiquitous in North American universities, and they're often well-intentioned, being designed to reduce student uncertainty and to increase transparency and accountability. I think all of them are pretty disastrous when it comes to encouraging students to think for themselves. Kantians, at least, should resist such trends. Write your syllabus on one side of a piece of paper, direct your students to the library, and as they set off, call after them, Sapere Aude. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for this tour de force from Kant to Soviet communism and the philosophical circles in there, to modern classrooms at universities and back to Kant again. There are a couple of hands already up. I think Andrea was first and then Martin. Andrea?
So thank you, David. Yeah, thanks a lot. I think the first, I have a comment. I think we share something on something being suspicious about critical thinking, and the others are, a question about the opposition of individual thinking and collective thinking. The first is the comment. I think, so thinking for oneself according to the first reading, so to say, which makes it too easy, as you said, it's too easy because thinking for oneself in one sense is just tautological. And so thinking for oneself is, I will come back to it, but in one sense, you might just say, yeah, so thinking for oneself is just thinking according, is doing something according to the laws of thinking. And what are the laws of thinking? The laws of thinking are the laws of truth. So thinking for oneself is just subjecting oneself under the laws of truth. And so that's So any thinking is, in this sense, thinking for oneself. But the same is so for the very same reason as it's tautological to say thinking for oneself. It's tautological to say critical thinking. Thinking as such is critical, because so thinking means to subject yourself under the laws of truth. So whenever something is revealed to be not true, is not recognized to be true, it's rejected by you, it's criticized by you. So thinking itself is critical in opposing itself to that which is not true. And so therefore, I just want to say, so I'm sympathetic about this to whatever, as if critical thinking were a special kind of thinking, so to say. What you want to say is, of course, there's bad thinking. So there's bad thinking. That's for true, but it's not that there is critical thinking and then there is whatever, something else, uncritical thinking. To learn to think is to be, in that sense, critical towards that which is not true. So, okay, so that's the comment why I find this whole program somehow disguised. And I mean, maybe a second comment is that we at our university, we have this in the philosophy department, we have this pedagogy for philosophy teachers at schools. And so that's what, and they are trained in one thing, and this is, you need to teach the students to be critical. So they don't know anything about philosophy because they don't go to class. They don't know anything about Kant and about whatever they should know, content. But at the exam period, what they tell you, what they have learned in this university is that they must teach the students to be critical. That's all. So the first thing that they must teach them is, and so that's why we are so, it's so disgusting in a way to be obsessed with that. So I was just saying so. But the other thing is more interesting. So the opposition between individual thinking. So you say, so there's no opposition between individual thinking and collective thinking. I mean, coming from Kant, I find it much more difficult to understand the very idea of an individual thinker. As I just said, the thinking for oneself on Kantian grounds is so what is the self? The thinking self. So if I think that must accompany all my representations, so self-conscious thinking, the I think that accompanies all my representations, this is not my individual I, it's the universal I that accompanies all my representations. So the I that accompanies them is the I of the laws of truth, and they are not mine. So they are universal. So the very idea of an individual thinker whose thought is in opposition to another thinker, on Kantian grounds, it is quite hard to figure out how me as a thinker can think of me as an individual. Understanding what thinking is. And so that's why it's no coincidence that in the first critique, the idea of a manifold of thinkers has no room. It's presupposed all the time, of course, but it's not something that the thinker can understand on the grounds on which he or she understands her thinking to be thinking. That what enables her to understand her doing as an act of thinking are the laws of truth, and the individuality is presupposed. So in that sense, on Kantian grounds, that's why the opposition, I think, for a Kantian makes no sense between individual thinking and collaborative thinking, because thinking is always thinking universally, and therefore anyone is already embraced by my thought. Now we figure out there is opposition, there's contradiction, there's disagreement, etc. But to any thinker, this comes like a shock. when I bump into someone who disagrees with me, that is like, oh my goodness, how could that be? I was thinking, so how could there be an opposition? I just saying this, that on Kantian grounds, the opposition individual thinking, thinking collaboratively is something that is difficult to be understood, and in no way a starting ground, and never could, and therefore it could never be something that could be in attention to each other. So,
yeah. Thank you. I mean, I guess I'm just going to agree with both of those points, though you managed to put the second one far better than I would have done. I mean, it's just so easy to take a sort of superficial conception of Kant as wedded to a highly individualistic picture of thinkers inherited from the early modern period, and so on, and then there looks like there's a problem about epistemic dependence and how individuals can relate to one another, and so on and so forth, and the nature of epistemic justification. So I think the insight that, hey, wait a minute, we have to understand what thinking is before we even begin to pose these questions of the relation between individual and collaborative reasoning and so on. I think that's extremely helpful. So yeah, I'm just going to thank you for the comment.
Next is
good to see you.
Next is Martin.
Hey, David, thanks for your talk. You already said that we've been in exchange about that, and I've learned quite a bit from you about this topic, especially that there is maybe no tension between thinking for yourself and thinking with others, because someone who can think for themselves is also, a better member of a group that reasons together. But I do want to push a bit. I think there's one way in which thinking for yourself goes beyond what one can contribute to a group, and why maybe it deserves special status. And I think it also pertains to your discussion of critical reasoning. So in the literature on group reasoning, two things stand out. I think one is that group reasoning can be better than individual reasoning, right? Groups, there are experiments that show that under certain conditions, groups, it's better to reason with others than to reason alone. But there must be important irrationality that you only find in groups. Groupthink, certain biases are reinforced, minorities aren't given a fair hearing in a group. Especially if groups aren't diverse, for instance, there is the worry that the results are actually bad. And I think one thing that critical reasoning allows you to do is to identify these pathologies or these rationalities that groups come up with, and to either correct them if possible, or to just take yourself out of the group and just reason for yourself if the group just goes off the rails and is irrational. And I think that's why reasoning for yourself has an important status and a value beyond beyond becoming a good reasoner in a group. If group rationality breaks down, you're in a good position to identify that and to then just reason independently of a group if you're good at thinking for yourself.
Okay, thanks, Martin. I mean, I guess I can see how that argument goes, but I'm slightly skeptical nonetheless, because I mean, sometimes it might be that the best way to I mean, there can be pressures within a group to conform in various ways. There can be implicit biases and so on and so forth at work. So it all becomes a kind of there are all kinds of forces that, as it were, press things internally. And so the metaphor kind of, you need individuals to break out of it. But there are also contexts where there's collaborative, it's precisely in collaborative reasoning that you start to see, oh, hang on a minute. There are issues of prejudice at work, and maybe the group, it's not that all the forces within the group need to be conservative. I mean, if you look at political activists who, I mean, you have to think, what are the conditions for the discovery of bias? So, you know, now we're in a situation where there's very high sensitivity to issues of diversity, inclusion, and racism, and privilege, and so on. Those insights are often insights that have come from groups, right? The outcome, perhaps, of forms of collective reasoning, rather than sort of individual insights that have broken out of spheres of oppressive thinking. So I understand the point you're making, but I also think it's worth looking at how forms of collaborative reasoning can themselves be a precondition of overcoming prejudice.
I agree with that. I just think that if they can't, it's a good thing that people have the capacity to step out of the group and just do their own thing.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And sometimes, you know, within a group, you can have obviously charismatic thinkers who are particularly articulate or bold and have the courage to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, should we think like this? And so all of that is true. But I think it's quite important to work with a sort of very subtle understanding of the relation, you know, what collaborative reasoning is, the relation between, you know, individuals and groups and so on.
Thank you.
Okay, there's more hands. Thanks, Martin.
I am next on my list, and I just want to comment on this last point about individual and collaborative reasoning. I had worked for a while on a couple of related topics with the psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer, and he has a non-standard view on critical thinking insofar as he objects to such courses being filled only with logic and probability and the informal fallacies, and points out, among other things, the positive effects, the psychologically positive effects of more collaborative reasoning, on relying on what's in your intellectual, social environment, and so on and so forth, both for problem solving and for creative thinking. Although with the latter, he is a little bit limited. But then he says also that at certain points, nothing really helps. And all you can do is, and he literally cites Immanuel Kant, think for yourself at some points, right? He literally does that. So maybe the dilemma is, even according to the current top state of the psychology of reasoning, the dilemma is unavoidable, is with us. Yeah, the problems of both individual and collaborative thinking that Martin pointed out are there, and you need both in order to deal with that. I wanted to ask you about the opposition that you did between standard critical thinking courses with their focus on logic, the informal fallacies, and probability as being codifiable in their rules and easily teachable, therefore, and on the other side, critical thinking courses or concepts that focus on creativity and open-mindedness and supporting courage and so on and so forth, which, however, come with the downside that they can't be, that these capacities can't be codified and are therefore not easily teachable except for by example or something like that. What makes you think that, or maybe your answer is simple, I'm misunderstanding you when I think that you think that those are exclusive for one another. Why not think rather the opposite, that like in piano playing or in tennis playing or in whatever kind of practical ability, you first need to learn all the technical details in order to become a proficient player. And then once you have done that, then you're at the level where you can start being creative, because you see that there is gaps and traps in the standard rules for learning the technique. And the same in logic and probability theory. If you want to criticize how the game is played nowadays, you need to first fully understand it. And so just like the piano student needs to learn very simple lessons first, yeah, before he can become a creative piano player. That's the same with critical thinking courses. So you need to teach students the hard and boring stuff first before you can teach them the nice things, by pointing out where the problems with current models of logic are, where the limitations of different types of probability theory are, and so on and so forth. So why make that opposite rather, or competitive rather than complementary aspects of critical thinking?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, it wasn't, my intention to, to dig in my heels over that opposition. I was discussing a paper by three philosophers of education, one of whom, Harvey Siegel, is a big figure in the critical thinking tradition. And the paper tries to set up this opposition between critical thinking on the one hand in its sort of epistemology, logic heavy traditional form versus focusing on intellectual virtue. And rather to my surprise, when I read this essay, that it came down hard in favor of sort of the traditional picture. My view is that it's wrong to think that it's one or the other, to have a kind of exclusive view, but it's not quite for the reasons you mentioned, because I don't think like the logic and the probability theory and that stuff is okay. You got to do that first, right? So learn modus ponens, and then later, you can learn to break it or something, right? It's not that first you do the logic, then you do the stuff about intellectual virtue and creativity, because in some ways you have to do it the other way around, because often if you're dealing with kids and students, often that they have forms of intellectual curiosity and creativity, and the trick is not to kick it out of them by giving them all these rules to play by, right? So the balance has to be finer than first you do the boring stuff and then you get to be creative. But I agree with you that it's not one or the other. Thanks.
Thank you. Next in line, in order of their appearance on the screen, is Paul Koher.
Okay.
Does your mic work now, Paul, or do you?
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Nice. Thank you very much for the talk. I would like firstly to disagree with Andrea Berg with what you said about critical thinking, and that you can dispense, get rid of this category, because truth is something universal. Because I would like to make the point that while truth is certainly it may be that truth is a universal category, but it is problematic to assume that universality is already existent as such, as a thing that we can grasp that exists there. And I think that autonomous thinking is also, or thinking for oneself, is also a matter of perspective. For example, I will develop other questions depending on whether I assume that the society we live in is a just one, or whether I perceive it as problematic. Or I will have, if I have certain experiences that I can have certain experiences that make problems visible in the first place. For instance, if I become a victim of discrimination, I will develop other questions if I other questions in my research. The method that I apply is certainly universal, and this is true. So there is universal truth and logic and all, but we cannot just take a bird's eye view or pretend that we already live in a united humanity and everyone participates in this neutral formal discourse. So therefore, I think that critical thinking is an important term, because truth is in a very specific sense also a question of perspective. Yeah, that's a point I wanted to make.
I guess what I would say is that I took Andrea's point to be something like this, that you can't set up this contrast between individual and collaborative reasoning as a kind of foundational premise of the way one thinks about this, with prima facie we've got a handle on what individual reasoning is, and so then we construct a notion of collaborative reasoning out of that somehow, and then we've got problems about if epistemic justification really falls to the individual, then what's going on when we've got can there be really a substantive sense of collaborative reasoning? I mean, I took Andrea to be saying, look, it's in the very nature of thinking that it is universal. And so insofar as one understands oneself as a thinker, one understands oneself not as entertaining the thoughts of an individual being, but as entertaining, as it were, what is to be thought. That's the position, and hence it's a shock when entertaining what is to be thought, you bump into someone who thinks differently. Like, how is that? I'm thinking what there is to think. So how can you come along and say something else? That was Andrea's point, and the idea is to say, look, if you think like that, then somehow the universality of thinking already, as it were, takes us beyond the individual into what is shared. Now, of course, it means that there could be bad thinking instantiated in particular finite individual beings, individually and collectively in interaction. But our way of understanding that has to be itself framed in this broader perspective of what it is that thinking is. That's the idea.
Thank you. The next in line is Peter Baumann, and then Kate.
Yeah. David, I found your remarks about epistemic dependency very interesting, and I might come back to that in my own talk tomorrow. What strikes me about when Kant talks about epistemic dependency or testimony, about that 18th century dispute between the followers of Thomas Reid and the followers of David Hume, as so often he takes a third position, which is more complicated, and namely to say, as one can see in the 80s later in the Critique of Judgment, and before that in that article about was heißt es, sich im Denken zu orientieren, he makes a distinction between subject matters. So on empirical, historical views, for instance, he thinks Reid is right, testimony is irreducible. But on, let's say, non-empirical questions of theoretical or practical reason, or questions of taste, he's much more of an individualist. So this suggests somehow that, according to Kant, questions about dependence, epistemic dependency or epistemic individualism are topic sensitive. And I wonder, I wonder to some degree what you think Kant would say about that, but I'm much more interested in what you would say. Is this whole question topic sensitive, and do we need to discuss it much more specifically with respect to topic by topic, case by case. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. It's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, one issue is the basis on which Kant makes that distinction. I mean, I guess one thought is that the more we are in areas where reason has an obligation to sort of look after itself and sort everything out, then you know, testimony is relevant only to sort of setting reason going, right? You still have got to think it through, because you know, you've got to endorse these reasons that you are discovering, and the only way to do that is to think them through yourself if it's a priori. Whereas in the case of history and geography and such like, there's nothing you can do. So then the question is, what's the most reasonable account of epistemic justification? Are you going to say you've got to have to somehow have independent grounds for thinking that what you're being told is true? That looks too strong. Certainly would mess up Kant's anthropology and all those writings, which are so heavily dependent on accounts. Although it might have been better if he'd thought more about whether they amounted to knowledge. But yeah, so then he goes with Reid and a more, okay, you can prima facie, you know, just take this to be knowledge unless you have independent grounds not to. If that's the basis for the distinction, I understand it. Though, I mean, I guess it rests in part on that in the case of a priori reasoning, understanding the proposition at issue, if I can put it like that, is a matter of, you know, grasping it from within. Whereas that's not true in the case of empirical testimony. So that's to say, grasping it correctly is seeing that it's true, and thereby that gives you grounds for belief and so on and so forth. Whereas in the case of empirical testimony, understanding it's never going, you know, you're not in a position where in understanding it you can see that it's true. All you can do is see that, oh yeah, it kind of is believable. So there's a certain topic sensitivity there. You know, my inclination is to think that would be really cool to explore and think about different domains of knowledge and different, maybe different contexts of discovery within domains of knowledge to see, you know, because often, you know, firstly, the testimony literature tends to be quite narrow in what it thinks of, you know, receiving knowledge from another. It's almost modeled on people telling you things like the train leaves at 2 o'clock or whatever, and understanding a historical treatise is not like it's not like that. Right? There's a lot more going on, and so I think there is potentially a depth to be explored here. But I that's all I can say at the moment. Thank you for the question. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
So I guess my question is sort of based on a hunch that I have about the way that Kant talks about thinking for oneself. And maybe it's because I sort of associate it a lot with his notions of autonomy in his moral philosophy. And my hunch is that understanding that it helps to understand thinking for oneself in terms of sort of overcoming a contrary inclination. So that it's not just, so sometimes I think sometimes we sort of think about critical thinking and we talk about critical thinking with students, and it's sort of like, it's as if we simply have bad habits of thinking and we need to overcome those. But I I think it's sort of more insidious than that. I think maybe the Kantian insight here is that we tend towards certain prejudices and bad habits because there's something that we get out of it, whether it's easier, it's more comfortable for us, maybe it makes us look good, or it helps us maybe fit in with others. I mean, I guess so. So I wonder, I guess I'll just ask, does that seem like something that helps make sense of commons of thinking for oneself? Is that something that, I mean, yeah, maybe it's more of a comment than a question.
Oh, it's good. It's good. Yes. Although, I mean, I guess the question is, what can be said in detail about the kinds of contrary inclinations that are at work? So in the ethical, we've got, inclination, which we can't, we have to come to understand that that's not what it is to think and act ethically. So we've constantly got to be vigilant about the influence of inclination. Whether we want to say that there's something parallel to that at work in the cognitive domain, I mean, other sorts of inclinations, inclinations to believe what's fashionable, what's cool, what's what will get you out of the room as quickly as possible, whatever. And I mean, this speaks to Martin's concerns about bias and prejudice and rationalizing and self-deception and so on. And I don't know whether there's something, as it were, universal to be said about, as it were, the structure of impediments to critical thinking that's kind of built into the nature of thinking, or whether it's just a whole range of different things.
I think what I'm thinking, maybe what makes me ask the question too, and this is just a suggestion for something you could follow up on. I think it's in acting on principle. I'm not sure, but I know that Honor O'Neill uses thinking for oneself as an example of a perfect duty to oneself. And it's a pretty convincing argument, right? That if you had a maxim of not thinking for yourself, it would be a contradiction in conception, because there would be nobody's opinion to follow. And I think it's really ingenious, which makes me really actually think that you can moralize thinking for oneself in a way that maybe we don't often, especially like when we teach critical thinking. Like, we don't want to sort of always be moralizing, and because that's tedious if people don't like that. But I think there's a sort of a Kantian argument to be made that there's a violation of a duty to oneself. And then I think then you can ask the question, what would lead us to violate that duty? Well, Kant's answer would be it's some kind of inclination or desire, whether it's to fit in or to something, Anyway,
yeah, I mean, no, it's good. That's good. I mean, I guess, my own philosophical sensibilities are such that I find the making of this as a duty. Like, oh God, here we go.
No,
Whereas I have,
I think we don't like that. Yeah. No,
but I have a more maybe Aristotelian view that, in some sense, this activity, the activity of thinking, which is essentially critical and is necessarily for oneself, if it's real thinking, is sort of, it befits the life form of a human being. It's rational life in action, as it were. And so you are, in some sense, doing violence to yourself if you do not exemplify this this way of being, if you like, this activity, because that is the activity that is distinctively human activity, something like that. I mean, I'm sure that would create groans in various audiences, this way of thinking. Andrea is very good at combining Kantian and Aristotelian rhetorics and idioms and so on. So maybe we'll hear from her tomorrow, right? In that vein.
That's great.
But thanks, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. But why would if I may just throw a short question, why would someone who devotes his or her life, let's say, not to a thinking activity, but to a sports profession, not be a good example of a flourishing human being?
So you need a notion of embodied rationality and embodied intelligence, because thinking and piano playing and all, sport and piano playing and all these other things that you rightly like and think of as exemplifying, lives well lived, are all manifestations of rationality, human rationality, in my view. So that's a reason to go embodied and inactive and so on. Then you can say that.
Okay, good. Andre.
Thank you for interesting talk. I'm sorry if it was already mentioned. I would ask about Kant's maxims of the common human understanding, which he writes in the Critique of the Power of Judgment. To think for oneself first, to think in the position of everyone else second, and third, always to think in accord with oneself. So additionally to just to think for oneself, to think universally, what we discussed today, and to think coherently. So to say, would you, I just ask about what do you mean to such criteria, but what I substantially would mean for myself about it, can we say that this universal criteria to think in the position for of everyone else would mean in Kant that we should think for different groups and taking into account not only universal subject, because such universal subject is empirically impossible. We have we should try to take into account all also contradictory position of different groups of interests and whatever it could be, of beliefs, and to try to find criteria or ways of decisions that could be proper for universal decision to bring in harmony of this variety of beliefs or interests. What would you also this universal as group criteria, and also about logical egoism would be the second question. But maybe it's too much for I will stop in.
Okay, thanks, Andre. Actually, the first question is also too much, really. But well, I mean, that's not your fault. That's in the nature of the problem. I mean, the injunction to think from the perspective of everyone else is, I mean, certainly in its English translation is puzzling, and one is inclined to. I mean, certainly there are non-puzzling interpretations, and there's a noble thought there. So it's easy to say, oh yes, yeah, we'll sort of pass over. That's right on, and then we pass onto it. So it can't just be it can't just be a reference to the universality of thought, because to think, to really entertain others' perspectives, if that's what Kant has in mind, that's of course something that takes some serious work and imagination and various the exercise of various virtues. And, you know, too often people have taken themselves to be occupying a universal standpoint and therefore empowered to speak for everybody else, and have behaved in ways that have been utterly unjust and horrible. So it's important, I mean, ethically, politically speaking, it's important to hear that second claim as something about meaningfully occupying the positions of others. But of course, that has to mean, it can't, I mean, empirically, of course, it's impossible to actually entertain the perspective of everybody else. So it has to mean that thinking must be guided by reasons that are compelling to any agent, not just you. I mean, it has to be a thought like that, that you have to think from a perspective that will uncover reasons that any rational being will find compelling. Something of that sort, or perhaps any reasonable being will find compelling. But just how far and how little that gets you in the domain of ethics and politics is something that, you know, maybe we will discuss tomorrow.